Hello and welcome back to Score USMLE. This is the second lecture in the Spinal Pathways series, and we are studying the ascending and the descending tracts. In the ascending pathways, we'll be studying the pain and temperature pathway, the light, touch and pressure pathway, and the discriminative touch, vibration and proprioception pathways. So beginning with the pain and temperature pathways. Now, the pain and temperature sensations are carried by the lateral spinothalamic tracts. You can look at the location of the lateral spinothalamic tracts on the cut section of the spinal cord. It's right there. Now, why is it called the spinothalamic? Very simple. The sensation is ascending from the spinal cord to the thalamus. We'll see how it goes to the thalamus in a minute. And why is it called a tract? It's called a tract because by definition, a tract is a collection of axons within the central nervous system. And spinal cord is a part of central nervous system, so by definition that would be a tract. And why lateral? Because of the location on the spinal cord. It's located laterally. So let's see how the pain and temperature sensation reaches the brain. So here's the pain and temperature receptor. Let's say this receptor is activated by a stimulus. Now the activation of this receptor activates in turn the sensory root of the spinal nerve, just like we saw in the introductory video. Now this bipolar neuron relays this piece of information to the second neuron in the dorsal gray horn, the cell body of which lies here in the dorsal gray horn. The axon of this second order neuron crosses over to the opposite side, the contralateral side, reaches the area of the lateral spinothalamic tract and ascends towards the brain, towards the thalamus. So now let's see how this reaches the thalamus. So this axon ascends through the spinal cord, then through the brainstem, and then enters the cerebrum and ends in the thalamus. Now it ends in the ventral posterolateral nucleus of the thalamus. Here's where the third order neuron begins and traverses through the internal capsule and the corona radiator and presents this piece of information of pain and temperature to the somatosensory area of the cerebral cortex. Guys, that's how the pain and temperature sensations reach the brain, and that's where you'll perceive them. Now, that was the theoretical thing. Now let me bring you to the kind of questions that will be asked to you on the USMLE. Now here's a spinal segment containing T9 through T12 spinal segments. Now, as we've just learned, the first order neuron will bring the pain and temperature sensations to the spinal cord, where the second order neuron will take over and cross over to the opposite side and ascend in the lateral spinothalamic tracts, right? So let's say this is the second order neurons of T12, T11 ascending together in the lateral spinothalamic tracts. Let's say this is the ascent. Now, and this is the second order neuron of the T9 spinal segment ascending in the lateral spinothalamic tracts. So now let's presume there's an injury to the left side of the T10 spinal segment. Let's presume there's an injury to the spinal segment right there because of trauma or vascular insult or anything really. So now my question to you is, will the pain and temperature sensation through these spinal segments be able to ascend through this damaged area? No, because the axons traversing through this area are now damaged. They won't be able to relay that information. But what about the T9 spinal segment? Will that be able to relay the information? Yes, because the level of injury lies below the T9 segment. So any segment that is higher than T10, that is the injured segment, will be able to convey the sensations to the brain, while the segments lying below T10 would not be able to do so. So what really happens if this is the area of injury and this is the left side of the spinal cord? What happens is that there's a loss of pain and temperature sensation on the opposite side, contralateral representation. Like we saw, the second order neuron crosses over. So at and below the level of T10, which is the umbilical level here, there is loss of pain and temperature sensations on the contralateral side. In our example, on the right side. So guys, do you see? This is how you will be asked a question. This is how you're supposed to interpret it. You get it? Alright, so let's move on to the next sensation. So the next one is the light touch and pressure. Now the light touch and pressure is carried by the anterior spinothalamic tract. You can see the location of anterior spinothalamic tract is in the anterior white matter of the spinal cord. Now compare it to the lateral spinothalamic tracts, you will see the lateral were located laterally and posteriorly to the anterior spinothalamic tracts. Now let's see how the light touch and pressure sensations reach the brain. Now let me tell you this, the light touch and pressure pathway is very similar to the pain and temperature pathway. So let's say this receptor is activated, and just like in the previous diagram, this dorsal sensory root neuron is activated and reaches the dorsal gray horn. Now here's where the second order neuron begins. The axon of this second order neuron crosses over to the contralateral side, but this time it reaches the area of the anterior spinothalamic tract and ascends towards the thalamus. Let's look at the next diagram right there. So you see this second order neuron of the light touch and pressure pathway is ascending in the anterior spinothalamic tract, and it traverses again through the spinal cord and the brainstem and reaches the thalamus, and it again reaches the ventral posterolateral nucleus of the thalamus. And here's where again the third order neuron begins, traverses through the internal capsule and corona radiata and presents the information to the somatosensory area of the cerebral cortex. Now in our example, the receptor and the sensation began on the right side, while the cortex that received the information was of the left side. Makes sense. Now this is how the light touch and pressure sensations reach the brain. Moving on to the next sensation, which is discriminative touch, vibration, and proprioception. Now discriminative touch is the sensory modality which helps us to sense and localize the point of touch. We're all aware of vibration, but what about proprioception? Proprioception is the sensation, is a conscious knowledge of the joint and muscle position sensing. To give you an example, I would say I can make you close your eyes and touch the tip of your nose with the help of your index finger. You'd be able to do it perfectly fine. How is that possible? With your eyes closed, you can't really see where the finger is going. But it is the constant feedback that the muscles and the joints of the finger and all the other parts of the body are sending the feedback to the brain about their relative position in space. That's known as proprioception. Now these three sensations travel together through the fasciculus gracilis and the fasciculus cuneatus of the posterior white column. Now let's see how this sensation travels. So here's the receptor for either of those three sensations. Now just like in any other sensation, when this receptor gets activated, the dorsal root of the spinal nerve carries that information to the dorsal gray horn of the spinal cord. Now the special thing about these sensations is that this bipolar neuron axon does not end here, unlike other sensations that we read. Instead, this axon turns backward to the posterior white column and ascends here on the same side, mind you, on the same side of the spinal cord. Now let's see where it goes. So here's that axon in the posterior white column that ascends towards the brainstem, and it reaches the level of lower medulla. And here's where it ends in the gracile or the cuneate nucleus, either of them. Now what happens in the lower medulla is that the first order neuron ends here, while the second order neuron, the cell body of the second order neuron lies in either of these, the gracile nucleus or the cuneate nucleus. And the axon of this neuron is known as the internal arcuate fiber because it arcs over to the opposite side at the level of lower medulla oblongata and then starts to ascend further in the brainstem. Let's take a look at that. So like I said, the second order neuron arcs around the central canal in the lower medulla and starts to ascend higher up in the brainstem. And where does it end? Just like every other sensation, it ends in the thalamus, and nothing new about the ventral posterolateral nucleus of the thalamus where it ends. Now here's where the third order neuron begins. Just like all other sensations, this third order neuron axon traverses through the internal capsule and the corona radiata and presents this piece of information to the cerebral cortex. Now the point to be noted is that the crossing over in the discriminative touch, vibration and proprioception pathway, the crossing over happened at the level of lower medulla and not at the level of spinal cord, just like it happened in the pain and temperature or the light touch and pressure pathway. So this is how the discriminative touch, vibration and proprioception is relayed to the cerebral cortex. Now coming on to a revision of the ascending pathways. Now we read about the pain and temperature pathway, which was carried in what tract? You're right, the lateral spinal thalamic tracts. Now did it carry the pain and temperature sensation of the same side or the contralateral? You're right, the contralateral side. What about the light touch and pressure? What tract? Anterior spinal thalamic tract. Ipsilateral or contralateral? Meaning to say the same side or the opposite side of the sensation? Opposite side, contralateral. And what about the discriminative touch, vibration and proprioception? Proprioception, what carries it? Posterior white column, the fasciculus gracilis and cuneatus. What about ipsi or contralateral side? Which one? You're right, it is ipsilateral side. So, and this is a picture showing the cut section of spinal cord with all the ascending tracts. Take a good look at it. And let's move on. So let's begin with the descending tracts. Now in the descending tracts, we'll be studying the corticospinal tracts. Now while there are other descending tracts too, from the standpoint of USMLE, we need to focus on the corticospinal tracts. Now the corticospinal tracts, as the name suggests, runs from the cortex to the spinal cord, and hence its name. So the corticospinal tract really begins in the precentral gyrus or the motor area of the cerebral cortex. Now this is a diagram showing the left lateral view of the cerebrum, and I want you to recognize the structure right here. This major sulcus here, which separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe, is known as the central sulcus, and the gyrus that is immediately anterior to the central sulcus is known as the precentral gyrus. Now to remind you all, the gyri are the mountains while the sulci are the valleys. This would be a sulcus while this would be a gyrus. So it's the precentral gyrus where the corticospinal tract begins. So let's see how this tract follows. So like I just said, the cell body of the neurons of the corticospinal tract lies in the cortex of the precentral gyrus or the motor area. Now the axon of this neuron descends through the internal capsule and continues to descend through the midbrain and the pons and reaches the level of lower medulla. The collection of these axons here is known as the pyramid. You can see that's the shape of the structure there, a part of the lower medulla which looks like a pyramid, and that's why the collection of these corticospinal tracts here are known as the pyramids. Now it is at the level of lower medulla that this axon crosses over to the opposite side and comes to lie in a region which is now known as the lateral corticospinal tract. This axon continues to descend in this lateral corticospinal tract to reach the lateral white column of the spinal cord. And guys, can I just remind you here that this is a single neuron that started in the precentral gyrus, and this is a single axon descending through the brainstem, crossing over in the medulla, and then continuing to descend in the spinal cord as the lateral corticospinal tract. Now let's see what happens when this descending corticospinal axon reaches the level of innervation. So let's say this is the descending axon of the upper motor neuron and it reaches the level of innervation, and this is the lateral corticospinal tract. So at the level of innervation, this axon turns towards the anterior gray column, anterior gray horn, and relays this information onto the lower motor neuron, the axon of which traverses through the ventral root of the spinal nerve and innervates the effector muscle. and hence the effector muscle contracts or relaxes or whatever the information is. But guys, this is how the descending pathway of the corticospinal tract works. But do you also remember that the message started in the precentral gyrus of the left side, while eventually the muscle supplied was of the right side, and hence the representation of the motor pathways is also contralateral. So let's move on to the last slide of this video. Let's learn this lamination of the spinal pathways, and let's use this mnemonic right here to help us remember it. The dorsal column is organized as you are, with hands at the sides, arms outside, legs inside, meaning to say the inferior spinal segment fibers would be the most medial ones, and so the sacral fibers would be the most medial. Following laterally would be the lumbar fibers, and then laterally would be the thoracic fibers, and then eventually would be the cervical fibers. Now, what I would recommend is that you remember the dorsal column lamination with this mnemonic, and know that all other tracts that we read in the lecture today have opposite arrangement of these fibers. So since the sacral fibers were the medial most in the dorsal column, they are the lateral most in every other tract. And while the cervical fibers were the lateral most in the dorsal column, they will be the medial most in every other tract. So you can see the spinothalamic tracts, both anterior and lateral, and the lateral corticospinal tract have an arrangement opposite to the dorsal column. Now, it's not important which mnemonic you use to remember this lamination, but it's important that you know this lamination, because there will be diseases that we'll see in the next video which will have different patterns of involvement of the spinal cord, be it from the outside or be it from the inside, and which really makes a difference, as the symptoms of onset of both of these diseases will be different. Now, we'll look at these clinical scenarios in detail and also practice some USMLE style questions in the next video to see whether we've learned something from these demos.